You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So, quietly recovering from my recent encounter with COVID. If you hear my voice being a little bit hoarse, then that's just part of my recovery at the moment. So I'm trying to do the best that I can at the moment with a bit of a croaky voice, but bear with me. I've got some interesting stuff going for you today. So we've been talking about well-being, especially mental well-being, and the idea of, are your thoughts driving you nuts? And one of the things I want to do in today's podcast is I want to do a bit of a deep dive into this whole notion of beliefs, ideas, thoughts, self-talk. Especially I want to focus on the idea that, most of us have a set of beliefs that may or may not be amenable to our mental health, our mental well-being. In fact, as I said in the title of the last podcast, some of the stuff that goes on in our head is actually driving us nuts. So, let's focus on the idea of beliefs. What's a belief? Well, if you do a bit of a check in terms of the definition of a belief, then you'll run across a few ideas, like a belief is an idea that a person holds as being true. Right? A person can base a belief on certainties, i.e. mathematical principles, physics, on probabilities, or on matters of faith. Now, we've got to be careful here because, as you well know from my last podcast, we were talking about stuff that's fundamentally true or not, okay? And in this podcast, I'm going to take a step into the notion of when is a belief irrational, okay? And I've got some really good examples for that. So the other part to beliefs is that they can come from different sources, okay? So they can come from my own experience or experiments, mental experiments. It could be about the acceptance of cultural or social norms like religion. It's also possibly about what other people say. That could be about education, mentoring, counselling, coaching, psychology, whatever it is. And a potential belief sits with the person until they accept it as truth and adopt it as part of their individual belief system. Now, this sounds all pretty good, right? But let me take it a bit further. Each person evaluates and seeks sound reasons or evidence for these potential beliefs in their own way. And once the person accepts a belief as truth, they are willing to defend it as part of their own belief system. Now, as you can see, this could actually hold within it some problems. And when we're talking about, emotional maturity and emotional responsibility, one of the first things that we really need to do is to examine whether the belief that I hold is sound. And we did some of that in the last podcast. Now, I want to put it into a practical context because I think this is where it gets really useful. A person who took up the challenges of helping us really examine our belief systems was a guy called Albert Ellis, and he was the founder of the Albert Ellis Institute and a form of therapy called rational emotive behaviour therapy. which is a style of short-term cognitive behavioural therapy that was developed by Aaron T. Beck. Now, Ellis trained as a clinical psychologist but found the options for treating his patients often lacking. He discovered that a lot of people didn't necessarily have neurological foundations for their psychological disorder or distress, but rather philosophical ones. And that is that, in his words, we have a tendency to operate with some really nutty beliefs, or to be more precise, irrational beliefs. So his dissatisfaction with the results he was seeing drove him to develop his own brand of therapy that emphasised action instead of talk. And I think that that's a very important element in maintaining our well-being. It's, talk therapy is fantastic, but we actually got to translate it into action. For example, there was a book published with the title Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And I love that title. I think it's brilliant. And it actually really describes how we need to address fear and anxiety. So let's dive a little deeper behind the idea of rational emotive behaviour therapy. Okay? So let's take a look at the framework of the theory. In rational emotive behaviour therapy, the whole therapy is based on the idea that it's not the things that happen to us that cause our problems, and this is a Stoic idea. It's our thought and thinking patterns that lead to the cognitive, emotional, behavioural issues that challenge us. And within that, Albert Ellis devised a framework called ABC. A is the activating event or adversity that we encounter. B is our belief or beliefs about the event, ourselves, and the world in general. And C is the consequences of our emotions and behaviour. Now, I talk a lot about emotional consequence, okay? So, Ellis believed that far too much emphasis was placed on the activating events and that most of the consequences were actually determined by how we think about them. Now, this was, at the time, a significant shift from the prevailing ideas, and it gave, in a sense, a greater degree of optimism to clients who were frustrated with their lack of results from traditional therapy. Now, traditional therapy in those days was fundamentally analytic psychotherapy. In other words, the sort of therapy that you freely associate it, and the therapist would interpret what it was that you were freely associating with. Now, in the rational emotive behaviour field, most of us therapists who are trained in this area will talk about two categories of cognitions, hot and cold. Cold cognitions refer to the way that we initially think about and understand what happens to us, while hot cognitions are the evaluations of our cold cognitions. Now, we don't have much control over our cold cognitions, as those are formed early on and are generally not really consciously understood. We're often not even aware of those. However, we can influence how we evaluate cold cognitions. Furthermore, REBT distinguishes between healthy negative emotions and unhealthy negative emotions. So a healthy negative emotion follows from adverse events that we approach with rational beliefs and adaptive behaviours, whilst unhealthy negative emotions stem from the irrational beliefs and maladaptive behaviours. So, an example of that might be, nobody loves me, therefore there's no point in making any relationships because I'm only going to get hurt if I do. So in REBT, I, as the therapist, essentially am there to help my client reduce these irrational ideas and beliefs and replace them with rational ones. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because, as we talked about, not everyone's immediately in touch with their irrational beliefs. So, to make this practical, there's a number of ways of doing that. And in REBT, we use homework. So, for example, we have homework sheets that outlines A, B, C, D, and E. D is the disputation of B, and E is the new emotional consequence. Okay? For those of you who are interested in this, by the way, please have a look at the internet. There's a whole bunch of really good resources for this that will help you play around with this, experiment with it. Okay, so what specifically did Ellis talk about in terms of what are the core irrational beliefs? Now, he talked about fundamentally there being 12. And I'm going to sort of condense this a little bit, and we'll pick up on it in our next podcast as well. But so let me quickly run through the 12 irrational beliefs that is a sort of cornerstone. Firstly, we're talking about the idea that there is a dire necessity for an adult human being to be loved and approved of by virtually every significant other person in his or her community, right? Think about, there's some problems with that. And we'll go into this in the next podcast when I'll talk about disputation. The second idea is that the idea should be, the idea is that I should be thoroughly competent, adequate, and achieving in all possible aspects in my life to be considered worthwhile. Now, we obviously know that that's possibly not going to happen. The third one is that certain people are bad, wicked, or villainous, and they should be severely blamed and punished for that. The fourth irrational belief is that it's awful and catastrophic when things are not the way I would like them to be. Again, a minute, reflect on that. Number 5, the idea that human unhappiness is externally caused and that people have little or no ability to control their negative emotions, sorrows, and disturbances. Number 6, the idea here, and this again, we're talking about irrational ideas, is that if something is or may be dangerous or fearsome, one should be terribly concerned about it and should keep dwelling on the possibility of it occurring. Now, when I work with people, I talk about catastrophizing. Okay, so there is the core irrational belief behind catastrophizing. The emotional consequence is anxiety. Number 7, the idea that it's easier to avoid than to face certain life difficulties and self-responsibilities. Now, again, this is behind things like procrastination, avoidance, including things like self-medication, self-sedation, and addictions in many respects. Number 8, the idea that one should be dependent on others and needs... Sorry, let me talk about this again. The idea that one should be dependent on others and need someone stronger than oneself on whom to rely. Okay? Number 9, the idea that one's past is an all-important determiner of one's present behaviour, and that because something once strongly affected one's life, it should be indefinitely having an impact on my life. Now, I'll put that into certain context because this is one where a lot of people challenge me about it, and I will agree with them because I agree with the fact that if you have had, attachment disorders, childhood trauma as an adolescent, as an adult, that is going to have an impact on you. But does it necessarily need to be of a debilitating nature? Okay. Number 10, the idea that one should become quite upset over other people's problems and disturbances. And this is where I always think about social media. Number 11, the idea that there is invariably a right, precise, and perfect solution to human problems, and that it's catastrophic if this perfect solution is not found. The utopian idea, right? Most perfectionists will resonate with this no end. They can't see a problem in it, or they struggle to see a problem in it. And the 12th irrational idea is the idea that you can give people, including yourself, a global rating as a human, and that their general worth depends upon the goodness of their performance, i.e., it's a conditional loving or caring. Okay, so I love you and care for you when you do the right thing. And unfortunately, that's a condition often parents fall into without necessarily even knowing it. Okay, now there's a few other ones here that are cornered around the idea of musts. One of the things that Karen Horney, who was a psychiatrist, established was that there is a thing called the tyranny of shoulds, musts and have-tos. And these basic deterministic ideas or beliefs are often at the root of someone's emotional disturbance or distress. And it's really worthwhile spending some time to raising your self-awareness around understanding this more deeply. You know, we can moralize, we can be judgmental, but is that really useful? And musts, have-tos, and shoulds really often paint us into a level of inflexibility that just causes more strife for ourselves and other people, especially the people that we love. So, for example, I must do well and win the approval of others or else I'm no good. How's that going to work? Other people must do the right thing or else they are no good, and that they deserve then to be punished. So we're getting into that area of sort of the moral high ground. The interesting thing, with a lot of teenagers that I work for is the third one, which is fundamentally life's got to be easy without discomfort or any inconvenience. And so one of the things that emerges in their behaviour with that is they become highly resistant the moment they need to apply effort. Now, sometimes that's driven by other irrational beliefs. But fundamentally, it's that which is at the core for, people not taking the right action. And this is where I come back to the initial thing. If I take the right action in a circumstance, it doesn't matter whether it works or not. At least I can tell myself that, you tried to do something, it may not have worked, but that's okay. You did try. And it might sound trivial, it might sound a little bit sort of light on it and a bit fluffy, but it's absolutely true. The example of, make your bed in the morning and at least you've done that. When you put that into practice on a regular basis and you hit, a tough patch, but you're still persisting with making your bed, that can get you out of a slump. All right, I hope this has been useful to give you an idea about a therapy that is actually in of itself very, very, very useful. As we talked about, it tends to be, in many respects, short-term focused, but it can be highly effective, especially with overcoming certain psychological disturbances like anxiety. And even in depression, we know that the ability to help someone examine their internal irrational beliefs and helping them to, counter with rational beliefs, replace them with a rational belief system will alleviate and in some cases get rid of the depression. Okay, I hope that's useful. Thank you for joining me, and I'm looking forward to having the pleasure of your company in the next podcast. Until then, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noartainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.